Good morning. It is Sunday, March 15th. How do we get to March? And we are so happy to welcome Dan Slater. If you have not read his book that he's going to talk about, The Incorruptibles, please do. I just want to tell you a little bit about Dan. He's the author of Wolf Boys, which was a Chicago Public School Library Best Book of the Year. We should look into that. Love in the Time of Algorithms and The Officer and the Entrepreneur. His new book, The Incorruptibles, was selected as an editor's pick by the New York Times Book Review. A graduate of Colgate University, New York Film Academy, woo, at Brooklyn Law School. Wow. He has written for more than a dozen publications, including the Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, blah, blah, blah. He was raised in Minnesota, well, Midwesterner, but he lives in New England with his wife and two sons. And with no further ado, Dan, please take it away.
Thanks, Vanessa. Are we screen sharing now? People can see? Is that
No, now you
no?
go back to share.
So I hit share on the Zoom,
You hit share on the Zoom, and
and
then I can see
then
it.
and now you're looking at my Google slide
Yes,
screen.
now. Yep. We're looking at it.
And if I go to slideshow now, do you see the whole screen?
I still don't, but we can see this.
Okay.
We're good.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Dan. I'm the author of The Incorruptibles. Welcome to the virtual version of this book presentation. Um, normally my talk goes to like 30 or 40 minutes. I'm gonna shorten it a bit today just because it's a Sunday morning and we may have family we want to see and things we want to do, or a book that we want to go read, for
Or
instance,
questions. We're going
or
to ask.
questions at the end. Maybe we
We
can
go
have
for
this
an
more of a
hour.
Q&A
Right.
based thing. The Incorruptibles is what is known in the publishing business as narrative nonfiction, which means it is entirely factual. It is a nonfiction book, but the author gives his best efforts to tell it in a novelistic way, meaning it is told in terms of character and plot. It is not an information dump. It is not a history lesson per se. And this true story is set in the Jewish underworld of pre-World War One New York City. And this was a time when the Lower East Side of New York was the most densely packed urban area in the world, having surpassed Bombay, India for that title. Bombay, India being the modern day Mumbai. And let's see. Here we have a shot of Lower Manhattan. This is probably taken from the East Village. This is 1912, looking down toward the Lower East Side.
It's frozen, Dan. I still see the whatchamajig.
It says my screen sharing is paused. I don't know
Why
why it's
is that
paused.
though? It shouldn't be paused.
Resume. What if I hit?
Yeah.
This is Phyllis, and
Hi,
I
Phil.
have a picture of the book on the front,
Right. You're right,
Right.
Phyllis.
and I have Dan off to the side.
Yes, that's correct.
I'm trying to hit resume and it won't resume.
I would stop it there and
Okay.
go back in. I don't know why it's doing that.
Still says now it says I'm screen sharing.
Yeah, we can see it now. Go to the next one.
Yeah, now
Yes,
you can see it.
we can see it.
We can see it. I've got 9 pictures down on the side.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, it should be full screen, but
Yeah, we're
Here it
good.
is.
We're good.
now can you see full screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
Okay,
perfect.
great. So this is Lower Manhattan. We're looking down from the East Village of the Lower East Side. This is kind of the master shot that begins the movie when you're kind of zooming in on the environment and the place we're going to go. Here we have Orchard Street, heart of the Lower East Side. Many of you may know that if you've been down to the Tenement Museum, if you've been to the Russ and Daughters Cafe, which is right across the street. This is
Yum.
where that is, Orchard, heart of Lower East Side. This is 1901. This is still relatively early in the Eastern European Jewish immigration. Some of you probably know a bit of this history. The Eastern European Jews start to flood into Manhattan in the early 1880s.
Yep.
And it is a migration that gains steam over the decades. And by the first decade of the 1900s, the Lower East Side is starting to get very packed. Here is the same street about a decade later. This is 1911, 1912. You can see it's starting to get a little more crowded, a little bit more grimy. It was a big ghetto. There were as many as 1,500 people living on a single square block. There were about 16,000 East Siders for every acre of park space on the Lower East Side. So if any of you live on like an acre of land, imagine 16,000 people trying to hang out on your property to get some fresh air. Very, very crowded. Families would sleep outside during the summer to get away from the heat of the tenements. They would sleep on the roofs. They would sleep on the fire escapes, or their kids would sleep while mom and dad would stay up, making sure that the kids don't roll off the fire escape when they're sleeping. It was very crowded. Kids would get food wherever they could out of garbage cans. Kids would eat a knish sometimes if they had the money, while other kids would look very jealously on at the knish. The kids would go around shoeless. Sometimes they'd go around pantsless. Boys would be seen smoking cigarettes outside, hanging out in front of saloons and taverns, drinking some beer, and gambling. There was a lot of gambling on the Lower East Side. The Jews loved to gamble. The kids started early, playing cards on the stoop, playing dice on the sidewalk. And they'd pick pockets. There was a lot of crime. Remember, this was a ghetto. If you went into any ghetto today in America, areas of Los Angeles, say, or Baltimore, or anywhere, you see a lot, you see a lot of vice, you see a lot of stuff going on because people are marginalized, there's poverty, and people are willing to take the risks that picking a pocket or stealing or dealing narcotics entails. Boys getting taken off in the paddy wagon, that was a common scene. Opium dens were all over the Lower East Side. This was a very interesting time for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that the anti-vice laws that we have today were just starting to come into being. So up until the early 1900s, up until 1907, 08, 09, 1910, you could walk into pretty much any corner pharmacy and buy every drug known to man in there. More than we know today, because it was all legal and it was all available. And during this time, anti-vice laws were just starting to come into being, and so this stuff was getting pushed underground. It was getting pushed onto the street more and more. Here's a guy shooting up in the entrance to an apartment or a tenement. There was a lot of crime and there was a lot of gang crime. Gangs on the Lower East Side, interestingly, they didn't just fight each other, which is what earlier ethnic communities were used to seeing. This was a situation in which the gangs would get hired out by certain business associations, such as the Hebrew labor unions. There were no labor laws at the time to protect workers. No minimum wage, no limit on hours worked, no safety regulations. So the labor unions learned that if they wanted to get some accommodation or something from the garment manufacturers, from the employers, they needed to push very hard. The Lower East Side was an interesting ghetto because it had this huge garment industry in it. If you go into a lot of ghettos today in America, you would not see them have a gigantic industry necessarily in the neighborhood. The Lower East Side had the garment business This was a largely Jewish-run industry that where most of the workforce were immigrant Jews and some Italians as well. This is a here we're looking at a manufacturer of men's shirts who apparently failed to do as the labor unions asked of him, and he paid the ultimate price. This was a common thing that would happen. There was another interesting kind of gang in the Jewish underworld. It was the Yiddish horse poisoners. This was one of the more surprising aspects in my research. This was a gang that had started, this was a kind of crime, a kind of gang that had started in Eastern Europe and the Russian Pale of Settlement. These guys would extort business owners that relied on horse transport to get their goods around. And the more perishable the good, the more vulnerable the business owner was to extortion. If he sold fruits and vegetables, if he sold ice cream, anything that needed to get to the buyer in an expeditious fashion, you really needed that, to make sure that your horses worked. And so the Yiddish horse poisoners would extort the business owners. Here's an actual letter that I was able to get um, that the Yiddish horse poisoner sent to a business owner. We don't need to read the whole thing, but it says, Mr. Zausner, we are now ready to do business with you. We demand from you the sum of $300. And then it says the details of what, when and where the money should be left. And if you go to the bottom, it says, we are watching you all the time, so beware. If you fail to do as we ask of you, we will poison your horses. I don't know how this particular horse passed, but this was a common scene on the Lower East Side, or really anywhere in the city, but particularly the Lower East Side in the early years of the century. There were about 70,000 workhorses in the city. And in those first years of the 1900s, they were starting to compete with the automobile. By about 1912-13, the streets of Manhattan were about 50-50, 50% automobiles, 50% horses. The horses had a miserable time of things with all these cars zooming around them. The last thing they needed was the horse poisoners on top of all that. So there were these horse disposal vans that would go around the city picking up horses that had died. So this poor horse is getting carted off. This was a common thing that people would see. On the Lower East Side, services were not as robust as they were in the wealthier parts of the city. So when a horse did die, it would often lay there for days or weeks before it got picked up. And if you read memoirs of Lower East Siders, you will see described in those books situations where kids had turned dead horses into jungle gyms and playgrounds and things, and it was quite something to consider. But this was what life was like then. The biggest underworld industry in the Jewish underworld was prostitution. This is a part of our history that we don't necessarily learn in Sunday school or bar mitzvah study. I had never heard of it before until I started working on this book. I had no idea that Jewish prostitution was not only such a big thing in the Lower East Side, but so well known about throughout the country. And if you wanted to be anti-Semitic, if you wanted to be anti-immigrant, if you wanted to keep immigrants out of the country, Jewish prostitution was something you would often cite as a reason. Here's a photo of a Jewish prostitute. Here is a dance ticket. So there was one of the things that really impressed people about the Jewish underworld specifically was its organization. That had not been seen in America before. Most of the crime, the gang stuff, was gangs fighting each other, stealing. You didn't have organization like business organization. The Jews organized the underworld. Each fiefdom within the underworld often had a sort of business association that kind of ran it. The pimps, the Jewish pimps, were particularly well organized. They would gather at a cafe on Second Avenue. It was 92 Second Avenue, where they would gather to do business and network with each other and pool their resources to make sure that the cops were paid off. They would also host these dances where the girls would go to have fun on Saturday nights, and they'd also be exposed there and made vulnerable to pimps and the lures of the pimps. Here's the back of the ticket, is a little chorus that they stole from an Irving Berlin song that had become popular in 1911. Um, Ragtime music kind of starts on the Lower East Side, and it's known for its edgy lyrics, often, mildly suggestive lyrics. And so the pimps would tend, I doubt there was any, I'm sure there were some copyright violations here, but they put this on the back of their ticket. This is not 92 Second Avenue we're looking at. The camera's probably, positioned right in front of where the pimps hang out. This is looking across Second Avenue at 111. Why do we care about 111 Second Avenue? Well, that was where the Sam Paul Association had its headquarters. The Sam Paul Association was the fraternity of Jewish casino owners and gamblers, and they operated in much the same fashion as the uh, Independent Benevolent Association, which was the pimping organization. Very organized. So there was a lot of crime, a lot of vice on the Lower East Side. And like I said, it did become fodder for the anti-immigrationists. And here we are looking at a popular anti-immigrationist, and he was actually the commissioner of the NYPD. This guy's name is Theodore Bingham. He ran the NYPD for years in the early 1900s. He did not like Jews. He wanted to spread the word about all the crime on the Lower East Side, and he wrote a very popular article in 1908 that appeared in a magazine called the North American Review. The title of the article was Foreign Criminals in New York. And in the piece, he blamed New York's crime problem on what he called Russian Hebrews. He said it should be no surprise that a people who are naturally unsuited for physical labor and who lack language abilities should turn to poisoning horses and selling their daughters in the street. He wrote, they are burglars, firebugs, pickpockets, and highway robbers when they have the courage. But though all crime is their province, pocket picking is the one to which they seem to take most naturally. So these were the kinds of comments that people felt free to just toss around in national magazines and things. There was quite a response to Bingham's piece on the Lower East Side. There were 13 Yiddish newspapers on the Lower East Side at the time. They all took a different kind of response to Bingham's piece. Some said, "Hey, this is really anti-Semitic." Others said, well, he's kind of right. There's a lot of crime down here and we should probably do something about it. Others said, well, maybe he just misspoke. Maybe he didn't really mean what he said, which is a kind of thing we're used to hearing today a lot. Bingham did retract his comments. He said they were based on faulty data. But at that point, the anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant voice to which he gave permission was becoming louder and louder in the years following the article, 1909, 1910, 1911. Meanwhile, while all this is happening downtown, there is another group of Jewish Americans in New York that are watching it all with horror. These are the German Jews. They live uptown and they live in mansions on the Upper East Side on Fifth Avenue. They worship at this beautiful synagogue on 43rd Street and 5th. It's Temple Emmanuel, which still exists today and operates out of the building further uptown. Um, the German Jews had come to America a generation or two before the Eastern Europeans began their immigration. The German Jews also came from a land of oppression in Germany, but it wasn't quite as bad as the Pale of Settlement had been in Russia. There had been a Jewish Enlightenment in Germany in the late 1700s. So when the German Jews began to come to America in the 1840s, they were coming from a slightly more enlightened place. And when they arrived here, they were ready to do business and ready to succeed. And they did so famously. We know many of their names today because those names still adorn important institutions, or they have until recently, in some instances, adorned very important institutions here in the US, Lehman, Goldman, Solomon. The Guggenheims made their money in the mining business, and then it was a generation or two later that the granddaughters started using it to buy art, and now we know them as an art family. But we still all these names, many of these names are still very much a part of the discourse today. They did very well here. They ended up running about half the firms on Wall Street. Their avatar, or the sort of head of them, was a guy by the name of Jacob Schiff, who is known as the Jewish J.P. Morgan. All of them took philanthropy very seriously. As I said earlier, there were no labor laws, but there was also no welfare net for the impoverished. So the German Jews took it upon themselves to try to elevate their brethren, the sort of their religious brethren from Eastern Europe who were flooding into the ghetto, who needed help. Um, Here's where Jacob Schiff lived. This was his mansion on 79th Street and Fifth Avenue. These were the kinds of places they lived. These were the kinds of spaces that the German Jews would have worked in down on Wall Street. This is what a stock exchange looks like. These are how their wives might have looked walking down Fifth Avenue or Madison with their big muffs on and these gigantic hats that were popular in the pre-war years. Here's how their kids would have looked playing in Central Park with their newest toys and bicycles and the governesses standing nearby. And instead of their kids getting carted off to jail for picking pockets, the cops helped their kids cross the street to go to their private academies and whatnot. And so they gave a lot of philanthropy. There were a lot of soup kitchens and bread lines on the Lower East Side. Some of this was controversial even then. I mean, today there are people who are opposed to welfare, right? Because they say, it leads to reliance on the part of the community. If you want to uplift, a community, the thing to do is not just to give them free stuff, it's to teach them skills and stuff and elevate them that way. So the same kind of controversies that we hear about today were happening then as well. Here's a matzah giveaway on Passover so that everyone could have their Seder. And here's a milk depot. There were a lot of public health initiatives that the Uptowners financed as well. Typhoid was a killer then. It was one of the biggest public health problems. And one of the big ways it was spread was through contaminated milk. So there was one Jewish German uptowner that was actually part of the Strauss family that owned Macy's department store. He got into public health and he took an idea that he found in France, which was the idea of a pasteurized milk center or a depot that would exist in each neighborhood, particularly poor areas where they couldn't afford to get pasteurized milk. So the Lower East Side moms could walk into a place like this and get pasteurized milk for a penny a bottle or something like that. And the Lower East Siders were out in the streets. They were protesting the lack of labor laws, the lack of protection for, the children in the garment industry. But when it came to crime, that was the one thing that the Uptowners really didn't know how to address. And they knew they needed to address it because they were opposed to the anti-immigrationists. They wanted to keep the borders open. The German Jews had obviously benefited from an open border themselves. They'd come here and they owed everything they had to that. They didn't want the bad reputation of their co-religionists in the ghetto to lead to closing borders. They didn't want it to lead to massive anti-Semitism. They wanted to clean up the Lower East Side as fast as they could, and crime was one of the things that was standing between them and their goal. They had they had made some attempts to eliminate the Jewish underworld over the years. Those attempts had often blown back in their face. However, by the summer of 1912, something happened that sort of forced their hand, forced them to take more steps, to do something more aggressive. And that was the murder in Times Square of a Lower East Side gambler and a casino owner named Herman Rosenthal. Uh, The Rosenthal murder was one of the biggest murder stories of the time. The people alleged to have murdered Herman were four Lower East Side immigrants, young men, and it was alleged that a cop in the NYPD had ordered the murder. There were many sort of salacious, sensational details surrounding the murder, which led to it becoming front page news for the next 3 years. But basically, what had happened is Herman Rosenthal ran the Sam Paul Association. This was the Association of Gamblers, Casino Owners. He was well known. He did well, and he got permission to open his own place in Times Square, to leave the Lower East Side, to go up to where the high rollers were. He bought himself a brownstone. He built a beautiful place for folks to gamble. And he was paying off the NYPD for the permission to do this. However, the cops then started raiding his place anyway. So he was angry. He felt slighted. And he started talking to newspaper reporters about it. He started going to the district attorney's office to make complaints. He was violating the anti-snitch rule that existed in the underworld that we still hear about today. And he eventually gets murdered as a result. The murder of Herman Rosenthal puts Jewish Vice on front pages, not just nationally, but all over the world. Everyone starts following the Rosenthal case. It goes on for 3 years. There's appeals and such. About a week after the murder in the summer of 1912, the German Jews get together. By the way, this is the Metropole Hotel in Times Square where he was knocked off. This is what Times Square looked like at night. Now we're out of the Lower East Side. This is sort of glam. This is the beginning of glam Times Square, New York. Beautiful illumination, these gigantic advertisements that people would gawk at. That no one had ever seen anything like this before. Here's another shot of Times Square at night. You see that Variety sign in the middle. Variety being the Hollywood newspaper, the entertainment newspaper. It had just started. I think its first year was 1908. There's the cop, the NYPD cop, who was accused of having ordered the Rosenthal murder. And these were the kinds of headlines that started appearing in the papers in the wake of the murder, because now any newspaper editor who had the inclination to publicize this stuff felt free. So the Jews, a race of gamblers, these were the kinds of things you'd see in papers. So the German Jews got together in the wake of the Rosenthal murder, and they said, we have to do something that we haven't done before. We need the stuff that we have tried hasn't worked. We need to be more aggressive in wiping this out. And they had identified this young man on the Lower East Side. His name is Abe Schoenfeld. He's 21 years old. And Abe had been raised in a family of reformers. He'd been raised by a father who was a popular reformer on the Lower East Side, a person who was always engaged in trying to elevate his neighbors, to improve the Lower East Side, to elevate the ghetto. And so Abe was raised in that kind of atmosphere, and he went into the reform world too, but he went into a very specific aspect of it, which is reforming the underworld. He dropped out of high school after his freshman year, and he became an underworld researcher, going into brothels, interviewing prostitutes about their lives. He knew about all the crime on the Lower East Side. A lot of the kids that he grew up with had been sucked into the underworld in one way or another. He really hated the underworld. He wanted to see it go. And the German Jews identified him. They kind of brought him in and said, hey, can you find us the names of the cops in the NYPD that take money from the gamblers? And let's start that way. This was kind of an unlikely mission to pull off. Where is he going to get that information? How's he going to do it? In the first few months, he has surprising success with this. He gets some names, and it allows them to more or less wipe out the gamblers. The mayor of the city sees this, and he says, why don't we take this kid and install him in the NYPD? We will allow him to pick the cops he wants to work with because he knows who takes money from the criminals and who doesn't. And we will allow him to go around the upper or the Lower East Side, sorry, and eventually around other parts of the city as well, and shut down whatever he feels needs shutting down. Um, this is an extraordinary amount of power to put in the hands of anybody, let alone a 21-year-old. But that is what happens. That was the seed of the story that I discovered while I was doing research for another writing project. And it was the seed that brought me into this story. There were many, as I started researching and writing it, there were many other figures who entered the fray, who entered the narrative and became part of it. But Abe and his war on the Jewish underworld was what got me into the story. It became the spine of the book, and I hope it pulls you into the story as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
We have one question in the chat. Were most of the pimps and prostitutes Russian immigrants, or was that just in the article you had read to us?
They were not all Eastern European immigrants, but I would say that in the Jewish underworld of the Lower East Side, the vast majority, if not the balance of them were. Yeah, you saw some German Jews, most of these were Eastern European immigrants. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the research? You in the book, you describe never before seen sources, including Abe Schoenfeld's reams of reportage. So, I mean, the research in the book was unbelievable. Where did you go? How did you find it?
Yeah. So this is going to sound super nerdy because what author refers to the endnotes of his book and directs, but I did write 80 pages of endnotes that are heavily edited by my editor. They are in the back of the book, and for those of you who are interested in exact sources, those were written to be read. They're written in a narrative form to be read, so you can definitely go there. I will say briefly that the research for this book was amazing and so much fun, and I obviously became obsessed with it. The book is the proof of my obsession. Um, stuff came out of library archives. There are a lot of library archives, and those archives take different forms. Some of them are archives that come from families, family information. Some of them are archives of things like trial transcripts. There's an amazing archive of trial transcripts at John Jay College of Criminal Justice on 59th Street. Those trial transcripts were amazing. There's newspapers.com, which is available to anyone who will pay $70 a year for the subscription. That is an incredible resource for researchers. And then a million books and things I'm not thinking of. But yeah, there was a lot, and it's all documented in the endnotes, which I encourage you to read.
I'm going to go back to that. If anyone has a question, oh, here we go. Did Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel come into your research?
They did, and so the book is probably 30 chapters long or so, and those 30 chapters are divided into four parts. The majority of my book, the majority of the story takes place kind of prior and right up to World War One. But part four of the book, the last part, takes us into the 1920s. And we do meet Meyer Lansky briefly through the lens of Arnold Rothstein, who is an important figure in the book.
You can raise your hands. You have to do it virtually or put it in the chat. I, of course, have more questions. Uh, Arnold Rothstein, Big Jack Zelig, Louis Rosenberg are central figures.
Mhm.
Which of the men surprised you the most? And when you research them, obviously you haven't met them. And was this the underpinnings or the beginning of the mafia?
This was definitely the beginnings of the mafia. Yes. the mafia as we know it today, I think I can say this, is an Italian thing. I mean, we all have been raised and weaned on the same popular culture, Martin Scorsese,
Yeah.
um, and Francis Ford Coppola and all that stuff. Um, what the I felt like this book was the story that hadn't been told. This is the prequel. As I said, what made the Jewish underworld so interesting and notable is that it was so organized, and no one had seen that before, that level of organization, taking an underworld business and just treating it like an industry. Um, that was the precursor to the Italian mafia. And in my book, particularly in the final part of the book that takes us into the 1920s, I try to show how that handoff works, how the Italians saw this and said, this is what we want to do, but we're going to do it in our own way. And so by the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, the Jewish underworld is more or less gone, the
Mm.
major part of it anyway, and the Italians pick it up. And the Italians are the people who are who all the movies are made about. As far as characters in the book, Big Jack Zealot, I mean, they were all so amazing to me, and I was able to get amazing research on them, which is what got me so interested. But Zelig is an incredible figure because he was this kind of Robin Hood type of figure who was very controversial. He was beloved by many. He was disowned by his own family, but beloved by many. Um, and I couldn't believe how young he was. That here was a guy who dies at 20, I think he was 25 years old, but it was like he'd lived three times that amount of time for how well he was known. And so that was really amazing to me. I wasn't expecting to come across a figure like that.
As I was reading through the book, and either I knew that he was young at the end, but I just thought he was so much older because of all of his life experiences, and to think that someone that young, and listen, it's a hard life, as we say, so
Yeah.
that he died is something else. Were there any parallels or connections between the New York and Chicago underworld?
Not so much, not so much. I think once we get to the 20s and we get into Prohibition, maybe more, you see cities interacting with each other because it becomes by and large a smuggling game and a very lucrative one. Um, a lot of the criminal reformers, the underworld reformer people like Abe Schoenfeld, the people that wanted to make crime go away, they initially approached it in sort of an academic way earlier on, where they would go to other cities to research what was going on there, but there wasn't a huge connection between them.
Well, look, they didn't, today you're sitting in Connecticut, we're in Chicago. I mean, um, just contacting somebody from those two cities at that time would have been a lot. Um,
Right.
can you tell us a little bit about the anti-Semitism then? And obviously, it's been a rough week for anti-Semitism here in the States, and what connections you see.
Hatred of Jews is just, it's this evergreen thing in history. And it just comes up again and again. And the more you research it, obviously, the less surprising any of this becomes. I'm I'm amazed that things like Weinstein and Epstein and Madoff don't become part of the narrative more.
Yeah.
If I was a rabid anti-Semite, I guess I would key in on that more. And what was interesting is that in this book, I'm writing about a period where that was how it happened.
Yeah.
That you love Jewish crime because there was a chance to hate on Jews more and more.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a point of departure. I don't know.
Were the reforms to the police department created by Teddy Roosevelt no longer in place during the early 1900s that you discuss in your book?
I'm sure they were. I'm sure the letter of them were, but the corruption was massive. It was a big police force then. It was 10,000 people then. There was a lot of corruption. It was a predominantly Irish police force, but there were a lot of Jewish cops, which I guess is something else that surprised me. And you saw a lot of sort of Cohens and Wolves and the NYPD. Um, there was a lot of corruption. Yeah, that's just the way it was. I don't think Teddy was a big reformer, and for the reformers on the Lower East Side, Teddy Roosevelt, especially when he then becomes president, he is a hero. And he comes back to the Lower East Side and he gives speeches at restaurants and things like that. So he did stand for something.
Okay. Um, we have talked a little bit about the prostitutes, and again, reading through the book, I thought that sometimes they were, this was the only way they could make money. They didn't have the vote, they didn't have this, they didn't have that. So, some of them were really, business women, and
Right.
I I appreciated um, I appreciated that part of the book. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the women?
I'm going to pass on that question,
Okay.
actually, because it's so robustly covered. And I
Yeah,
would
okay.
love people to read the book, and I would
Yeah.
never be able to do it justice. It's such a big part of the book.
It is.
All I
And
can say, this is what I can say is
yeah,
that these women are so impressive. And in some cases, we're talking about girls.
yes.
We're talking about 15, 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah.
The courage of these women and what they endured is mind blowing. And the ones that we've heard about traditionally are the Clara Lemlichs and these ones that make the history books because they stood up to the capitalists and such. But what I found was that the much more common experience, obviously, not all the Lower East Side girls and young women became Clara Lemlichs. Most of them were more complicated than that and lived more complicated lives.
Yeah.
And the lure of prostitution, the lure of the underworld, particularly when those factories were as brutal as they were, that was a real, it was there. It was there. And yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing to see all the traps that were set. And if you were a 15-year-old girl or a 17-year-old girl going out on the Lower East Side, living there during these years, I mean, you had to be really brassy and tough, and they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole thing, I appreciated that part of the book and how in depth you went. I have another book club where we read Jennifer Brown's The Whisper Sisters, and it's set
Mm.
in the same time period. They're immigrants, and it's a woman running a bar. It's during Prohibition. So I think it was based on, somebody in her family. It's fiction, but what it, what these young girls had to do, it was just unbelievable. I kept thinking about that in the whole book, how young everybody was. The crooks, the policemen, everyone.
Yeah.
And I suppose, living in those crowded tenements and TB and all the diseases, they died young.
Yeah, they died young and then a lot of them lived but yeah, there it was a big ghetto with no welfare net and
Mhm.
no labor protections. I
Yeah.
mean, imagine that today. Imagine what that would look like.
Yeah.
We have it. I mean, you guys, you're in Chicago, so you can drive a couple miles and see
Yep.
some of the worst of what you can see in this country. I mean, now imagine it now without all the stuff we have,
Yeah.
you know.
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to
Yeah.
imagine. Um, Phyllis asked, how would a female earn money to support herself if she had no husband or father to support her or was not taught to read?
You were in a garment factory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A
You would have been in
locked
a garment
garment
factory.
factory.
You might have been a sort of mother's helper or a maid. The maids tended more to be Irish in the city during that time. Um, but it was definitely limited. If you didn't read, it was definitely limited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think the Jewish families reading was probably a something that they encouraged and was important and valued. And uh, because the kids could go to school and the new generation, their parents, immigrant parents, maybe they could read Yiddish or I'm going to say Yiddish. I don't think, they spoke Russian or some of them did. Hopefully that transferred to some jobs and differentiated
Hmm.
differentiated them. Um, can you tell us, and I am a little bit about, even though we're talking about the Incorruptibles, Wolf Boys, because that was a Chicago City read.
Yeah, that was so yeah, the Chicago Public Library selected Wolf Boys as one of the best books of 2016. That was my second book. It was my first book of narrative nonfiction, where I'm doing the kind of work that the sort of approach to storytelling that I'm using here. That was a contemporary story that I was covering. It is a book about American boys living in South Texas who become hitmen and operatives for what then was the biggest drug cartel in Mexico. It's about their lives and their pursuit by a particularly talented homicide detective in Texas. Um, it is very gritty. It's very raw. It's very honest. Um, I spent 3 years going back and forth um, to Laredo, Texas, which is where the boys were from, to their, the prisons that they are now in, which are all over the country. It's a deeply reported book, and it was a very important book to me, and it did sort of set the tone for the kind of work that I've been doing for the past decade since or so.
Yeah, that is so
Yeah.
important. You said before that, the Jewish underworld, this one that you talked about disappeared, but is there any Jewish underworld in 2026? There have to be some Jewish
I'm
gangsters.
sure. I'm sure maybe there are Russian Jewish immigrants
Oh
out in
yeah.
Coney Island or something yeah, but it's not something you hear about specifically. Again, the Jews have done well in America for the
Right.
most part, and so what we hear about is wrongdoing and sociopathy amongst powerful Jewish people now. Um, again, which isn't often discussed as a Jewish thing, but
Thank God.
yeah.
The book is bookended by the notorious killing of Herman Rosenthal in 1912 and Arnold Rothstein in 1928. Both murders went essentially unpunished due to police and political corruption. What does that outcome say about the ultimate success or failure of the Incorruptibles mission?
Oh, I don't think it says anything about the Incorruptibles mission because they didn't care about these sensational murders. They were
Right.
trying to elevate their neighborhood and wipe out delinquency and things like that. And whether or not they succeeded is going to be up to the reader to decide for themselves.
Huh.
Yeah.
Um, if you have more questions, please put them in the chat. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, what are you working on next or
The
now?
next book is a very different kind of book for me. It is a memoir of childhood trauma and recovery.
Oh,
I am the son of a sociopathic father, which
oh,
maybe puts some of my work into perspective. That fact of my life has been an important fact of my life, and it's been something that I've been wrestling with and recovering from. And it's the book I never thought that I would ever publish, even though it's the one I've been working on the longest. And now it is finally reaching people in my circle, my friends and family, and my book agent and editors are now just reading it. And so the story is getting out, and it feels very good to have that read, and that will be probably coming out in 2027.
Okay. Definitely looking forward to that. Is your dad still alive?
He is.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah.
Um, any other questions? We have a couple more minutes. Otherwise, I highly recommend go get this book. It's very it just drags you in. You want to see what happens, and you start listen, I felt bad for some of those young gangsters who died. I know what they were doing was terrible, but I thought your writing was great.
Thank you.
Fabulous
Thank
book.
you so much.
Fabulous
And
book.
thank you for being here and coming to hear about the book and thanks for your support. It means so much to me that you might read it. And if you do, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a note or even
Okay.
better, post a note online or post something wherever you hang out online, your Facebook page to help spread the word. This has been very much a book that has gotten around because of synagogues and the
Yes.
JCC
Yeah.
circuit talking
Yes.
about it.
Yeah.
So,
Dan
thank
is
you.
from with us from the Jewish Book Council. That's how we were able to, have you here this morning. And a great book. Everybody go read it. And I'm really looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thanks for having me.
All
Have a
right.
great Sunday, everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.